blind.
Mm.
You know, they had old age assistants and aids of the disabled and aids of the blind, and then general assistants. Well, this guy had aids of the blind, and so we were talking on his front porch, and he said, well, would you like to come in the house and have a cup of coffee? I said, sure. And I just opened the screen part way, not thinking what I was doing, and he turned around and walked straight into it, got it between the eyes. And I said, well, that's pretty good proof that you're blind.
Jesus.
But he saw the fine humor.
Okay, I was gonna say, I hope he didn't punch you in the face. So actually, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about being a social worker. Why did you decide you wanted to be a social worker? Was that something that you chose to do, or just a job you got somehow?
Why did I want to become a social worker?
Yeah, I mean, like, did you, was that a job that you chose, or a job that you just sort of happened into?
Yeah, it just seemed like a good idea at the time. When I got out of college, and then went to work for the bank for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that was fairly boring stuff, but fine. And then finally I applied for the welfare job and got it. And got it in Hillsborough.
Uh-huh.
So I became acquainted with, Hillsborough area and Beaverton and Loa, etc. And then my aunt, who raised me, thought that I'd be a really good teacher, and so she said, well, I think that you ought to apply for a teaching job. And I had taken student teaching, so I did, and got the job at Sunset. And then once they hired me, I went back and finished up my master's degree at Oregon State.
In history?
Yeah, and then went to work, so I had my master's to start with, and so, in fact, that led to a little more pay.
Right.
Working for welfare, teaching, and in the process of that, I really enjoyed being a social worker. You got well acquainted with a lot of people who were in need of things,
Right. So it's interesting for me. I mean, coming from sort of a distance in time, my knowledge of the 50s is sort of through this rose-colored image of pop, like the movies and such, and you get this image that, coming out of the war, 50s, everybody was fine. What sorts of problems were people having that you were having to help them with? I mean,
social problems?
yeah, I mean, like, well, social workers help people with the problems that they have in their life. So, I mean, what were there common problems?
Yeah, there was, from my point of view, there was no difference in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. They're all the same for the people on welfare, because they just, in large part, did not have jobs. They had no money to speak of. They didn't get good, adequate medical care, and oftentimes didn't know how to, save their money and use it in the right way when they did get money. And that same thing is true today. And when I was teaching, one of the main things that you come up with in social science teaching is what are the needs of society, like in an election year,
Right.
The people that are the poorest are the people that aren't represented,
Right.
So that fit perfectly. And I knew from firsthand what it was like to see the people that were in need of, jobs and health care. And
Were the people who you were working with, were they, did they have a certain, quality in common that maybe related to the Second World War, or being immigrants, or
You're talking with about welfare?
yeah, I mean, like I imagine if I were to speak to a welfare worker today, they would be talking about people whose family maybe a generation ago was in industry, factory work, and those jobs are gone now. Or maybe coming from an immigrant community, I don't know. But I'm just wondering, the people that you were working with in Hillsborough and Beaverton in the 50s, were they coming from a kind of a similar experience? Did they have an experience in common? Or was it just a bunch different?
No, I don't, from the time I first went to work for welfare to the time I retired from teaching, I kept up on the welfare programs also. I don't think there was any difference between the workers in the early days versus the late days, or the clients in the early days versus the late days. I mean, it was
the late days being now, or the late days being when you left welfare?
Well, now.
Now.
It's just that the caseworkers, in large part, were interested in helping to solve problems that were bugging people that, were not having enough food or no
Right.
place to live, etc.
Right.
I mean, they were a good group of people,
Yeah.
interested in helping, and they did good work from my point of view.
What resources did you have? And when you went, let's say for instance, you go to someone's home and it's there's a lack of income or food or health care. I mean, were you able to provide those sources?
Provide what?
Like did you feel you were well funded as a social worker to help them, or did you feel kind of stuck when you were doing that?
Yeah, I
Does
did.
that question make sense?
Yeah. I did because at that point in history, for me, I wasn't much aware of the funding of the programs.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, we had whatever we needed.
Okay.
Now, the thing is that, like in medical care, for example, the way we handled the shortage of money was that in Hillsborough, or Washington County, when all the doctor bills were completed for a particular month, they were turned into the welfare department, and then they were all prorated.
Okay.
So that doctors did not get what they charged. They got what the prorating was going to be.
Sure.
So maybe everybody gets 2/3 of what they charged.
Right.
And the same with drugs. And so in effect, it didn't seem to make any difference as far as the welfare office is concerned. We said to the doctors, take care of the people, write the prescriptions you need, and they'll get prorated down. So
Right.
nobody gets cut just because they're welfare.
Oh, that's good.
Now, I don't know how that goes now.
Yeah, I don't know how it goes now either. Can I ask another question? So you mentioned Merle Cressy there for a bit. I'm just curious, like now that I've been teaching for just a few years, like who were some teachers that influenced you? Like, were there other teachers that you met either at Sunset or through the convention or MUN elsewhere in the state who you thought were really good teachers? And how did you know that they were a good teacher?
Yeah, that sort of thing did influence me, but not because I knew people that were good teachers. It was the opposite. When I was going to college, I thought about teaching, and when I was doing some graduate work, I thought about teaching there also, but the teachers that I knew in my view, from what I knew of them, were really bad teachers. I remember one kid that was teaching social science at one of the schools in Portland said to me when we were having coffee one day, he said, you know, it's really a good job to have, this business of teaching. Your first year in the building, take really good notes so that you can teach from those notes, and you'll use those notes for your entire career. And
Wow.
you know, I mean, I told him that's ridiculous, and I never ever did that.
But how did you know not to do that? I mean, like, for me, I've had poor teachers, but I've also had good teachers that I'm like, oh, I want to do that. Were there other teachers? You mentioned like this crazy person who said, you know, I'll teach the same lessons the rest of my career. But I mean, were there not, when you were either starting out teaching or when you were a student at Franklin, that you said, I want to do what they're doing, or were there not? Was that not the case?
Not the case. I
It's not very humble of you, but okay.
you know, from my own experience in high school, for example, and then in college, I had a bunch of what I thought were poor teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, except for 2 or 3 that I thought were good. Like, for example, one professor I had was a professor that taught the history of education. He was a professor at Oregon State.
Okay.
And he had everyone go out and do some research on some school. And I went to the Seventh-day Adventist school in that little town about 7 miles south of Forest Grove.
Okay.
It was a Seventh-day Adventist, and I went there. And well, it turned out that school was a boarding school, and the kids went there and stayed there for a year or 4 years, whatever. And you know, and when I was making the report, I gave the report of what I thought what it was about, and then he asked me. He said, "Well, what's your view? Is that a good way of teaching? Is that a good way to run a school?" And I remember saying, "Well, I thought for a while, and I said, I'll have to think about that one. Yet I'm not sure." And he was great. He said, "That's perfect." He said, "You ought to do that. It needs some thinking about it."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was really good. He didn't expect me to say, well, yes, or it's a good or bad or something.
Right.
And for the most part, I had not very good teachers in high school or college. But, you know,
Seems strange to go into being a teacher.
what?
It seems strange to me to want to be a teacher if all of your experiences with teachers are poor.
Yeah, except that I thought I would be a good teacher. And I patterned my teaching based on nothing that I had been a part of. You know, and it's like, have you ever watched the movie or the show on television, MASH?
Sure.
Okay. Hawkeye and the other characters in there, in large part, you know, made fun of the military and officers that were spit and polish.
Uh-huh.
Okay, well, that's the way good teachers did of the administrations of school districts.
Mm-hmm.
Because administrations, in large part, were only interested in keeping order,
Mm-hmm.
not in creative teaching.
Right.
But some were good.
Right.
And in Beaverton School District especially, obviously since I was there, I mean, we had convinced our people that being creative was great.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we did some programs, as you well know, that were that had the potential of stirring up the public.
Uh-huh.
Some of the conventions we did, and when the Rajneesh were in Oregon, for a year or two, um, we invited the Rajneesh folks to come to our Metro Congress class at Aloha High School.
Oh.
And in that classroom that night, I believe there were more people from the central office than there were Rajneeshis. Everybody thought that it was going to be a brainwashing session on the part of the Rajneesh.
Right. Was it the Rajneesh who came as well?
No, it wasn't. It was just these people, the Sannyasins, as they called them. But they were very good, and they didn't, try to brainwash or anything. They just told their program and what it was like, etc. And our purpose in doing that was to point out to the kids, you got to be able to look at every group that's in our society. Like today, Muslims.
Right.
And what do they believe, etc. And so when the Rajneeshis were there, I mean, they gave their views, and they may have gilded them a bit, but nevertheless, they told us what they believed and so forth. And it wasn't bad. Mm-hmm. That their philosophy was okay in part, but only in part. Mm-hmm. The Rajneesh had some pitiful views as well as some good ones.
Sure.
And so we discussed those, and that seems to me that's the way you got to handle things. We discussed it. The kids were great about discussing, and they discussed with the Rajneesh people that were there their philosophy, and everybody, it seems to me, had a good time. And nobody became a Rajneeshi as a result.
That was the next question. Is how many students did you lose to the Rajneesh?
No, none. But it's just that one theme that I had in my whole teaching career was critical thinking. And I really did seriously work on that a lot. And then about halfway through my career, the school district said that, okay, every teacher at the high schools at least were to now have a theme for the year. And so I had critical thinking. And we were supposed to switch it every year, but I had that every year because I had new students every year.
Sure.
And it was essential that critical thinking was essential. Well, you can't have critical thinking unless you look at both sides or several sides of an issue.
Right.
So that worked out really well.
Hmm.
And then all of this led to our political conventions we used to run every 4 years, where we set up a statewide program for high school students to enact what they thought was going to be an accurate selection of the president from whatever party that we'd chosen to do. And we would, give every school that was involved a state. They researched that state and then came to the Republican convention or the Democratic convention and selected the person that was going to run. And our people, the kids, did really great. I mean, we have had a great record. The national press and so forth always appeared at our programs, and they could have used us as a
barometer for the real thing.
Yeah.
So,
and as a matter of fact, one year, and I can't remember the year right now, but one of the schools that had the proper state selected, who was the woman that ran as vice president?
Ferraro.
Geraldine
Ferraro?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
in 84, right?
What?
In 1984, Geraldine Ferraro?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they selected her, and she was unheard of as far as the staff was concerned. And they thought, my God, I mean, how could they have come up with somebody like that? And that's who it was chosen. Yeah. It was amazing.
Were some conventions better than others? And what made the good ones good? Or were they all good, in your opinion?
They were all good at least from one point of view, they're really interested students. I've never had a student go through one of those conventions